Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody. I can see myself. Welcome to another, I was going to say podcast, a Empowering Plans podcast, but now that there's video, I don't know if it's a podcast. I know it's not a vlog because a vlog is a video blog. I think, listen, I'm out of my element. What I do know is as I look at myself, I look very tired. But if there's one thing that can wake me up, it is a stimulating intellectual discussion. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to make do with a conversation with Nick. Hi, Nick. So Ron Peck, Chief Legal Officer of the FIA Group, here with me today is Nick Bonds, attorney with our FIA Group Consulting Division. Good morning, Nick.
Morning, Ron. Yeah, I'm going to do my best to wake you up here. I'm probably about as tired as you feel, but we'll see what we can do.
No, this is great. This is great. Listen, when the word came down from on high that all of these podcasts are going to be done now with video, I was so excited for so many reasons. Number one, because I have to now worry about how I look. Number two, because there's no opportunity for outtakes or editing, right? What's not to love about this format, right? But that's great because you know what? We've got nothing to hide. And, I've listened and watched quite a few of the recent podcast videos that we've done. And there's one thing that really jumped out to me. And you know what that was, Nick? That they're very intellectual, very cranial. All right. So I said to you, Nick, we got this podcast coming up. Let's just do something that's fun, that's lighthearted, that's going to get people engaged and interested, right? Something funny. And you were like, oh, that's a great idea, Ron. We're going to do something hilarious. I said, maybe we do a podcast about the Minecraft movie. Maybe we do something about people, their driving skills, or, let's talk about millennials and Gen X and whatever. And he said, Ron, I got one better. Let's do discretionary authority. Nick, listen, man, I love you. But if I ever need a creative idea for a comedy on Netflix, I'm not coming to you, all right? But listen, The more I think about it, the more I realize this really is an interesting discussion. It's an interesting conversation, and it's one that needs to be had. And I say that because I've been with the FIA Group now for almost 20 years at this point, okay? 2 decades. And one of the first things I learned about when it came to ERISA and self-funding and health benefit plans was this concept of discretionary authority, right? Was discretionary authority. And at the time, it really related to subrogation, okay? It was about subrogation. It was, do you have to pursue reimbursement even if it'll cost more than the lien is worth, right? Or can you let it go? Can you reduce your lien by a third for attorney's fees, three-way split, all these different rules that apply, right? All the games we play in subrogation and claims reimbursement, even if the plan language doesn't specifically say so, right? And this concept of plan administrator discretionary authority, okay, really plays into that subrogation and that right of subrogation and the authority to pursue a lien, to reduce a lien, to go after this, to go after that, right? And so it's extremely important when it comes to the enforcement of subrogation. But as the FIA Group's sort of role in the self-funded industry and servicing these plans expanded, so too did the importance of discretionary authority. So really quick, just sort of covering the basics, and then we're going to dive into some details, Nick. And that's when I'm going to need you when it's time for the real stuff.
For the fun.
But for the good stuff. But for those who are listening, discretionary authority, what do we mean by that? Generally speaking, if you assert the right to discretionary authority, and that's a key important thing. and Nick, I know in our discussions and the outlines that was one of the things you highlighted, is it's not inherent. It doesn't just automatically happen. There's case law out there, there's precedent, Supreme Court cases actually, where the judges in their opinions state that in order to exercise discretionary authority, which we're going to talk about what that is, you first have to assert the right in the plan document. So the plan administrator first in the plan document says, I have discretionary authority. Okay, under law, under the terms of the plan, what does that mean? It means you have the right to decide what something means or doesn't mean, what the plan does or doesn't do in instances of ambiguity. And what that means is sometimes you can't necessarily predict everything, right? There are going to be times when maybe two experts are going to come in with differing opinions and you're going to say, which way do I go? Is it medically necessary or not, right? Or two experts come in with differing opinions. What do I do? Was that act illegal or not, right? And so there's these instances where there could be multiple facts, multiple sources of information, and they don't necessarily agree. And someone needs to come in and be that King Solomon and sort of split the baby, right? Which is not exactly the right metaphor, but you know what I mean. You have to be that sort of decision maker and say, in the presence of differing opinions, in the presence of differing facts, this ambiguity, this lack of detail, right? You have to exercise that discretion. And I remember I was at a conference. This was many, many years ago. And, I had a coffee mug or whatever. And I said, what color is this mug, right? And at the time it was black, but for those who are watching, this is not a new, is the dress blue or is the dress gold? This is not one of those. This bottle is blue, okay? And I say, what color is this bottle? And everyone has to say it's blue because that's not ambiguous. That's a fact. And just because you have discretionary authority, you don't get to look at this bottle and say, I say it's yellow. That's not what discretionary authority means. It doesn't mean that you get to look at a fact and just ignore it, okay? Fact, bottle is blue. But if I then say, hey, what's a nicer color, right? What's a nicer color? Is it this blue bottle, right? Or is it this green pen? That's a matter of opinion, right? It's not a fact. Some people will say the blue, some will say the green, right?
And cuts the dependent in half. And
cut that dependent in half, Solomon. So, it's understanding when discretionary authority actually comes into play versus not. And I think, Nick, coming into this discussion, one of the things that you've pointed out is that we're starting to see people who either shy away from discretionary authority and they just want someone else to make the decision. And then on the flip side, you have some people who are maybe overestimating how much power discretionary authority gives them. And they're making judgment calls and saying discretionary authority empowers them to do so, even if it's contrary to all of the facts, right? And that's when you're straying into that realm of ambiguity, of being arbitrary and capricious, right?
Right.
Of breaching your fiduciary duty, where if you just ignore all of the facts and say, I don't care that everybody agrees that the answer is white, I'm saying black, right? And it's just, there's zero basis for it, but I've got discretionary authority, I make the call. Down is not up is not down, left is not right is not left. Sometimes facts are facts and you have to do what the facts dictate. So there's a limited sort of scope or opportunity to exercise that discretionary authority. And it's really coming up in a few areas that you've witnessed in particular, one of which is this concept of maximum allowable charge, right? And how a plan defines the amount that it will or won't pay in a given circumstance, which is even more relevant now as we start to see an expansion of out-of-network claims, as we start to see use things like reference-based pricing, as we start to see narrow networks in the face of the No Surprises Act, right?
I was going to say dealing with NSA claims and qualified payment
as you're
amounts.
paying, it's going to matter more than ever. Not only that you exercise discretionary authority, but that you have true factual evidence that supports the decision you made and that it wasn't arbitrary and that it wasn't a capricious use of that power. So Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the areas you've been seeing this and how it relates?
Yeah, so I think you talked about it originally from the context of subrogation, which is still obviously, an essential tool in a self-funded plan's arsenal. But it is kind of it permeates the plan and how the plan is designed and set up at such a fundamental level that the discretionary authority of the plan sponsor, of the plan fiduciary, is so fundamental that it's sort of one of the building blocks for the flexibility and the power we talk about plans having when they self-fund to sort of define their limits, define how they're going to pay things, define how they're going to make people eligible. And one of the big ones, exactly like you were saying, is the max allowable charge definition. And this is basically, the plan's established limit for the maximum amount it wants to consider allowable for a particular claim. Like even for a claim that's covered, this would establish kind of the outside limit of what the plan would pay. And that's inherently something that can't be too specific, just because there's such a variety of claims and ways those claims might be submitted, might be charged, might be calculated. You kind of need the plan's language here to have a certain degree of flexibility so that it can apply in all the situations and in all the way the plans need it to. But that inherently means that it's going to be at least a little bit ambiguous, which is where that discretionary authority comes in. And we've seen, some plans love that. They kind of fully embrace having that authority and that flexibility to say, what this is what we want to cover and why and how and when. And sometimes plans, I think, especially when they're kind of new to self-funding and they're used to being in the fully insured world where they just kind of have their policy and they set it and forget it, they maybe aren't quite ready to fully embrace that. They kind of run away from it and don't want to kind of shoulder that responsibility of the fiduciary duties that come along with that exercise of discretionary authority. But this is kind of the classic situation with the max allowable charge language, where the plan is basically making a judgment call. It's deciding, which plan standards apply, why, looking at all of the facts and circumstances, kind of taking all of that on board and trying to, cohesively explain what is going to be reimbursable under the plan.
So you bring up an interesting point, and it's not just limited to max allowable charge, but it's very relevant here in particular. I find that you've got two types of people in this world, Nick. All right. Have you ever been to the Cheesecake Factory?
Once or twice. Yeah.
Once or twice. One of the things, if not the thing for which they are famous, it's not the cheesecake, it's the size of the menu. All right.
It's almost as long as one of our plan documents.
It's bigger than a plan document. They joke about how the menu is like hundreds of pages and there's all these items. I mean, how many places do you know where you can get a Chicago hot dog or a beef stroganoff, at the same place that you can get like a grilled cheese sandwich and on a cheesecake? Like, it's ridiculous, right? They've got everything under the sun. All right. It's a huge menu. And for some people, having that much variety, that opportunity to like make a decision from so many options is comforting, right? It means that no matter what, I'll be able to sort of find the right answer somewhere. But for other people, it's almost overwhelming, where it's like, I don't want to have to make this decision. This is the type of thing I want someone to make the decision for me.
You get that kind of paralysis of too many options.
It's analysis paralysis, 100%. Trust me, I grew up with that. So Cheesecake Factory is great for some people. For others, you're going to spend an hour sitting at the menu. What do they want? Right? They want like, what is it? In-N-Out burger, right? Where I think there's like a hamburger, a cheeseburger, and that's it. Like, if you want to get fries, you're going crazy here. Don't try to remove the lettuce. They're like, oh, you're going off menu. Forget it. Keeping it simple, right, is the other side of the spectrum. And for a lot of employers who have, you mentioned it, traditionally be on a fully insured plan, okay, so they just pay their premium and now it's somebody else's problem. How the claims are processed, what metrics are used to determine the payable amount, in-network, out-of-network, etc., that's someone else's problem. So it's really easy to just have that black box approach, that set it and forget it. And when I'm paying a premium and now it's somebody else's problem, right, whether it's being done accurately or not my issue, right? Whereas when I go into self-funding, and a lot of employers, a lot of plan administrators are now moving to self-funding, and they have been over the span of the last 2 decades because it becomes more and more financially viable to do so. One of the unforeseen or unwelcome side effects of self-funding is that there are times when you're going to have to make a decision, a judgment call that you maybe didn't have to make in the past. And there is a certain comfort that comes with plan language that says, if it's out of network, we pay Medicare plus 30%. Because what you're doing when you use language like that is you're basically shifting the burden of decision-making off of the plan administrator and onto CMS, onto the government, onto Medicare, right? Oh, that's an overpayment. Don't blame me. It's Medicare. That's an underpayment. We're going to balance bill the patient. Don't blame me. It's the bureaucracy. It's those politicians. Go complain to CMS. If Medicare paid more, I would pay more, right? So it's a scapegoat. It's someone else's problem. There's two issues with that. Number one, like you mentioned, we know that in some instances, Medicare rates are not that fair, whereas in other instances, it's actually excessive. How do you adjust for that if you're shifting the entire burden onto Medicare? Number one. Number two, also, if someone asks you to defend or justify the amount that you've paid in the face of an appeal, saying, well, that's what Medicare does, is not good enough. You need to be able to justify it yourself, right? So that's issue number one. Issue number two, okay, and this is another issue, is, well, what if there is no Medicare rate?
Right.
How are you going to figure out the payable amount there? So there's just a lot of this arbitrary and capriciousness, and frankly, a lack of exercising of any real fiduciary judgment when you just shift the burden. But the issue, like you've said, is if you adopt language that says, I'll make a decision on a case-by-case basis, depending on my whimsy and whatever I decide at the time, is too far in the other direction where there's no real rules or basis for your decision-making. And so it's finding that happy middle ground where you can outline specific metrics and factors that you use in making your judgment, but they're tools in the tool belt that you as a fiduciary can use to make the right decision on a case-by-case basis. And so finding that happy middle ground is important. And I think it either takes having the right allies, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? Or, experience. And unfortunately, we've seen quite a few instances where vendors and plan administrators and TPAs and carriers have been sued for breach of fiduciary duty because they tried to take what felt like an easy, expedient way of doing it, and ultimately it didn't satisfy their fiduciary duty. Another place where you're seeing this a lot, and I know you've mentioned this, and this caught me by surprise, and so I want to hear why, is the issue of NQTL testing, mental health parity. This is happening with greater frequency. How does this relate to the plan administrator exercising their discretionary authority, and what are the risks? What should we be watching for?
So one of the fundamental things that we're looking at when a plan has to do their comparative analysis, which they're required to do under the CAA, where they basically have to look at every single non-quantifiable treatment limitation that they put in place on their mental health benefits. They have to ensure that those NQTLs are in parity with the NQTLs on their medical surgical benefits. And that analysis involves a lot of parts, the chief one of which is probably looking at both that the plan is written to be in parity and is administered to be in parity. And anytime you're talking about, interpreting and applying plan language to actual claims, you're inherently bringing in an issue of discretionary authority. And also kind of tying back to what you were saying about with the max allowable charge and with reference-based pricing, there's sort of a trend with the NQTLs that a lot of plans have in place where they might put an NQTL on a mental health benefit and not have a clear rationale or justification for why that limit is there and why it's set at the amount that it might be set at, or why it's being used and applied the way that it is. And that's part of, a key step of the analysis that we have to perform for these groups that we're working with. And so we'll go to them and we'll say, so why do you have, why do you require step therapy for this behavioral therapy program? And they'll say, well, we don't know. We just took that from either like the state benchmark plan, or we took that from the Blue Cross Blue Shield plan that we had 5 years ago, and they just haven't considered it. They haven't put in the thought to use their discretionary authority to kind of outline exactly why they're applying those limits in the way that they are. And that can lead you not only into issues with mental health parity problems, where you might inadvertently be applying limits out of parity with your medical surgical benefits, but that can lead to all kinds of issues down the road where you're maybe not administering individual benefits on a uniform and consistent manner, where you're not actually properly exercising your discretionary authority, which can lead you to issues with breaches of fiduciary duty. And then on top of all of that, on the back end, if you're trying to get your claims reimbursed by your stop loss carrier, and if you're not administering the plan in a clearly in line with the terms of your plan documents, and you're relying on a case by case, we'll make a discretionary determination on the day of, the stop loss carrier almost always has their own right, their own power to interpret and apply not just the stop loss policy, but the language of the plan document itself. And they will almost always say that any exercise of discretion that veers away from the express terms of your plan document, we're not going to reimburse. So you could have a situation where the plan is not only operating out of parity, not only breaching its fiduciary duties, but is also going to be on the hook for whatever claims that they do pay, because they're not going to get reimbursed after the fact by stop loss.
You bring up a number of interesting issues, and I think one of the overarching issue that you're talking about as well is the concept of sort of uniform process versus uniform results. And
right.
one of the great things about discretionary authority is that on a case by case basis, the results may differ. It may be that you find, claims are payable in one instance, but not in another, or benefits are available in one instance, but not in another. And the fact that it's not cookie cutter is because you're exercising that discretionary authority. But where there has to be some uniformity is in the process that gets you to that end result, right? You have to still apply the same rules or fact finding every time. So the same rules apply even if the end result is different. It could be one of those situations, and for the sake of argument, to simplify this, I have somebody who gets injured going through, a red light. They're driving through a red light, and I don't pay the claims in that one instance. And then in another instance, somebody goes through a red light, they get hit, and they're injured, and I do pay the claims. If you're the individual whose claims were denied, you're going to look at that and you're going to say, hey, seems like a little bit of, discretionary authority, is starting to look a little bit more like, favoritism, right? It's like, what's going on here? And it may be that even though the end result differed, despite the fact that it looks like the same type of scenario, and my process as the fiduciary, as the administrator, exercising my discretionary authority is that I look at where did it happen, right? Are the laws the same, right? It could be one was in New Jersey and one is in New York, and that the level of offense is greater in one state versus the other. Is this a repeat offense or a first-time offense? Did they have a license or not, right? And so there's an entire investigation process that I apply uniformly. And in certain instances where I could go either way, it's that process that pushes me one way or the other. In other words, show your work. Right. My 9-year-old, he's learning math. It's not enough to know the answer. The teachers require you to show how you came to that answer. And this concept of black box answers, where we don't know how you came up with the answer and your only response is discretionary authority. It's not going to fly. It's not going to fly. And with the last, 2 or 3 minutes we've got remaining, Nick, it seems to me like there are lawsuits out there which sort of prove what we're saying is true, where, yes, discretionary authority gives you that wiggle room to make that final decision when you have evidence on both sides of the argument, and you can pick which side you want to side with. But what you can't do is, when all the evidence is on one side, say, I will ignore all of the evidence and go with the side that has no factual backing whatsoever, right? And this is happening. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of the lawsuits that you're following?
Yeah, we've been seeing this kind of growing trend of these class action lawsuits, especially with larger plans. They might be in an ASO, but a lot of times it's a situation where the plan has hired an administrator that maybe has a relationship with a PBM, and the plan just sort of accepts whatever the administrator and whatever the administrator's hand-selected or potentially wholly owned pharmacy benefits administrator is saying they need to do to cover these claims. And we've seen some pretty ridiculous outcomes from situations like that. Like in the I think it was in the J&J case where the plan found that through its PBM, through its formulary, it was having to pay, I think, like $10,000 or something for a multiple sclerosis drug. And then they looked and they could go down to Wegmans, no insurance, and get that same drug for a fraction of the cost, for less than, I think, like $600 or $700. And so there were these just inexplicable markups on the formulary that they were bound to through this contractual arrangement with their administrator and with their hand-selected PBM. And the plan participants were looking at that saying, hey, plan sponsor, what are you doing? You're not exercising your discretionary authority the way that you're supposed to. You're not being loyal and trying to administer the plan in the best interest of the plan participants. You're just accepting whatever they're giving you. You're not questioning the rates that these drugs are being paid at. And it has led to these big class action lawsuits that we've seen several big examples of here recently. A couple of them have stumbled on standing, actually, and we've seen a couple of those cases be dismissed on standing grounds, but none of them have really dug into the merits of some of these participants' claims for breaches of fiduciary duty, for improper exercises of discretionary authority. And one of them was actually recently just refiled. I think that was the J&J case, actually. It had been dismissed for lack of standing, and the plaintiffs, this is again a class action lawsuit. So these are big, complex lawsuits. Those plaintiffs have sort of amended their filing and have refiled. And we expect to see that actually get some traction. We're hoping to see a court actually kind of wade into the facts of this case and look at how these plan sponsors, how the administrators and PBMs are sort of not fully performing their duties and exercising their discretion in the way that ERISA and the plan participants require. So we're keeping an eye on several of these cases. I think a new one recently, like in March, was just filed against JP Morgan. We talked about the J&J case. There was the big Wells Fargo case last summer. There's also another case that just got filed at the end of last year, Owens and Minor v. Anthem Health. And this is actually not the plan participants, but the plan itself directly suing its administrators. So the TPA is being accused of, one, improperly exercising discretionary authority, which that's its own whole can of worms, where if any entity improperly exercises discretionary authority, you can make yourself a fiduciary to the extent of that authority that you exercise. But in this case, the plan sponsor is basically suing their administrators, saying, you made yourself a fiduciary and you breached the fiduciary duties that you took on by your exercise of discretionary authority, and kind of highlighting that can be a double-edged sword. Like, it can be really powerful having that level of control and authority over the plan and plan assets, but it comes with this, this mantle, this requirement to actually operate in the best interest of the plan and the plan participants. And we've seen, examples where it looks like the discretionary authority and the fiduciaries exercising that authority have sort of fallen down on that job. And it'll be interesting to see how these cases actually play out once they get through motion practice and once we see some actual decision making happen from a court where they kind of dig into the meat of it. But I'm very excited to see kind of how this all shakes out. I think it's going to kind of shake up the industry a little bit and shake up how a lot of the administrators, especially the big administrators and their PBMs, operate in this space, and hopefully make it better for self-funded plans going forward.
One of the words that you used was inexplicable when you were talking about how much was being paid for a particular drug. And in our industry, one of the terms or phrases that's getting thrown around a lot these days is transparency, right? And when you're talking about transparency, most people in our industry that talk about transparency are talking about transparency when it comes to prices being charged by providers, right? But it's bigger than that. You look at, for instance, the gag clause prohibition, right, under the Consolidated Appropriations Act, right? So what is a gag clause? A gag clause is the opposite of transparency, right? It's meant to hide information. So transparency when it comes to fees and when it comes to terms, right? Data sharing, numbers. So transparency there. I think transparency is also honestly one of the key factors to successful implementation of fiduciary duties and discretionary authority. Because like I said before, when I was talking about my kid and showing your work, that term inexplicable, it doesn't necessarily mean wrong. It just means you haven't explained it, right? I've seen situations where in a vacuum, it appears that somebody is overpaying for something egregiously, to the point that you would say they're clearly violating their fiduciary duty by overpaying. Where the entity turns around and says, this is one part of a bigger business arrangement. Here's the contract. By overpaying a little for this drug, I'm getting a 99% discount on this other drug, so that net, the total exchange, you're saving money compared to if you were to purchase them on a one-off basis. And you look at that and you go, oh, as a fiduciary, you made a decision that ultimately saved me money. I started this conversation by talking about subrogation, right? You could look at a situation where somebody has a lien for $10,000 and they're being offered $3,000 as settlement of that lien, right? And somebody looks and they say, Ron, you're going to go write off another $7,000? You're breaching your fiduciary duty. As my subrogation vendor, are you a fiduciary? No, but let's pretend I am for now. You're violating your contract then, right? This is bad faith, bad practice. I'm going to sue you. You're breaching the contract. Until I point out the fact that in order to pursue a lawsuit to get the full $10,000, it's going to cost you minimum $20,000. So net, you're losing $10,000 at a minimum.
Right.
Oh, well then in light of those facts, $3,000 ain't too bad. So again, it's all about being able to show your work and explain or justify the decision. And so just like you, I want to see how these things shake out, not necessarily because I think anyone is clearly in the right or wrong, but because I want people to start showing their work. Transparency, I think, is a friend when you as a fiduciary are making decisions based on good, justifiable, evidence-based facts. And I think that'll keep you safe, even if the end result on its own may not make too many people happy. You can at least show them why it's the lesser evil in many instances, which is sometimes the best that we can hope for. So again, don't be afraid of being a fiduciary. Be afraid of being arbitrary. I think that's sort of the end message here, right?
What about sums up? Yeah.
Absolutely. Keep the plan's interests front and center, even if sometimes it's one step back, maybe it's two steps forward. That's the nature of being a fiduciary and exercising that discretionary authority. Show your work. Hey, Nick, you know what? Maybe not as funny as the Minecraft movie, but not too bad, my friend. I think this was a very valuable discussion. Sometimes it's important to get back to the basics for a lot of us. On behalf of myself, the industry, the FIA group, Nick, Pat the Man Santos, the greatest podcast producer nobody knows, thank you so much for joining us for another Empowering Plans podcast with the FIA group. We really appreciate you spending the last 30 minutes with us. Be well, take care of each other, and see you soon.
Take care.